right, welcome back. Now, non-state actors to the Africa Climate Summit have issued demands and red lines ahead of the summit that is set to be held from the 4th to the 6th of September, that is Monday to Wednesday next week. Kenya will play host to the summit following a directive by President William Ruto, who is the chair of the Committee of African Heads of State and Government on Climate Change. The Africa Climate Week aims to tackle the escalating challenges posed by climate change and the consequent global and continental ramifications. Pan-Africa Climate Justice Alliance, that is PACJA, has been championing for climate justice. And tonight, in this conversation, I'm joined by Charles Mwangi, who is the head of programs and research for PACJA. Mr. Charles, welcome to our studio tonight.
Thank you.
It is a great pleasure having you back.
Thank you so much.
Now, perhaps how is PACJA preparing for the African, Climate Summit that is set to be held next week?
Thank you so much. The Africa Climate Summit actually was sanctioned really by the African Union some years back, I think in 2019. Of course, that came through because of the push that we, the civil societies, have been, the pressure we've been putting, demanding, for an African, conference on climate change that really addresses the plight of the African people and that canvasses, issues, that are relevant, to the common, African communities, especially those ones that are affected most by the impacts of climate change. And now, Kenya is privileged because our president is the chair of the Committee for Heads of States on Climate Change under the AU, and therefore he's actually hosting that particular summit, but it's an African Reunion Summit. Kenya is only a host. But we have that particular privilege of hosting this particular event. But just to say that we were really hoping that this process would be a process really that touches on the critical issues that affect, the common, people and the communities at the front of the climate crisis, like I did mention. And we hoped issues like adaptation would be given a lot of prominence. Issues on climate finance would be given a lot of prominence, and of course, looking at the special circumstances, for Africa, especially considering that we are a continent that is contributing risk to the emissions, but we are also the continent that is experiencing the greatest impact of climate change. And therefore, we have been following that particular process as non-state actors. We have been issuing, of course, our demands in terms of how we want this process to be, because we believe we represent the people, and we believe we must not lose this opportunity that has been provided, for us to come together as a continent and for us to argue our issues, to debate our issues, to dialogue as African people. So we are preparing for the same, but I want to say that we have a framework under which we are engaging in this particular process, and that is the non-state actors steering committee, which we formulated or we put together in April. And this is a committee that brings together a diversity of stakeholders. We have the indigenous people present, we have the young people, we have the academia, we have the women, constituency, the farmers, religious institutions, and we have been able to come together to form that committee, which we were hoping would actually be fundamental in the process of developing the agenda, for that particular summit, and of course, deciding the course that this particular conference is supposed to take. That may not necessarily have been the case, but I think we can engage in that conversation in terms of then how we are planning to ensure that we are not left behind in advancing, the climate justice cause for this continent.
Okay, so these non-state actors are the, the different groups of people that you've just mentioned. The youth, the women, they constitute the non-state actors. All right, and in your demands, you actually seem to portray the developed countries as the enemy of climate justice in Africa. And maybe how exactly are they contributing to climate change?
Thank you so much. We are not necessarily calling them enemies. We don't believe that they're necessary enemies, in this particular context. But just to say, if you look at history, the reason as to why we have climate change is because of greenhouse gases emissions. and mostly the carbon dioxide, that comes, from burning of the fossil fuels. Now, truth be told, the developed world, of course, a developed, area, than ourselves in Africa, and in the course of their development, that trajectory led us to where we are because they emitted so much to the extent that now we have the impacts of climate change, but those that are felt, in the continent, of Africa. But what you're also saying is that these countries, the developed countries, also have got the capacity, to support, adaptation and serious building for the communities that are mostly affected, especially from the continent of Africa. And therefore, whenever we are calling for action from those countries in terms of availing the resources that are needed to cushion, our people from the impacts of climate change, we are not necessarily asking for too much or asking for tokens. We are talking about the developed world, of course, taking responsibility and actually paying for the mess, because about 20 countries are responsible for about 80% of the emissions. But these 20 countries are also responsible, again, of the control about 80%. Of the global total, global GDP. So they have the capacity to do so. But we're also saying they also need to cut down their emissions because science tells us, especially from the reports from IPCC, that we need to cut our emissions by 43% by 2030 if we have to keep the 1.5 degree, target alive. But that 43% may not necessarily just come from Africa. Africa only accounts for only 4%. It has to come from the West. So reduction of the emissions is a must if we have to raise the dream of sorting out this challenge of climate change, but also resources must be availed, to support those communities that are mostly affected by climate justice. And that is the reason as to why we uphold the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, where we are saying whoever has emitted more must therefore pay for more, in terms of bringing, the solutions. But now the challenge that we have, especially with the design of the summit that is taking place, from forth, is that we are shifting, from that principle to this principle of shared responsibilities, which we believe is very dangerous for this continent because we must continue calling and pushing for accountability from the highest emitters.
So is Africa contributing anything? Because I believe it also emits to some extent.
Well, given an opportunity, Africa also has got the capacity to emit as much. In any case, we've now discovering oil, exploring oil, and of course drilling the same. And we have the potential to also emit as much. But the beauty here is that because we are still low in terms of our development, we have an opportunity to take a different trajectory than what was taken in the north, or by the north. And reason being, we are well endowed with resources that can actually be able to generate renewable energy sources. We experience almost 12 hours, of solar, which you can be able to tap. Our geothermal potential is massive. We have hardly exploited even 10% of the same. Our wind potential. So we have an opportunity, to take a different trajectory. And therefore, we still also feel we have a contribution, in terms of making sure that our development is actually low carbon development. And that requires resources. That is why most of the national retirement contribution documents that African governments have submitted are so much ambitious. But again, if resources are availed for us to implement those indices the way they are, then we'll be taking a trajectory that is carbon neutral, so to say, or low carbon, so to say, at this particular juncture. But then if we are not supported to do so, then probably that dream may not come true in the near future.
Okay, allow me just to, make a follow-up on what you've just said. Maybe what is PACJA doing to ensure that the, fight for climate justice actually reaches even the rural areas, because, the non-renewable energy sources are still under use in the rural areas. What are you doing maybe to reach the grassroots level as well?
Thank you so much. And like I did mention, our focus is really so much on the communities of the front line. Because until we are able to touch the lives of those people who are experiencing, drought, those communities in Malawi and Mozambique, who, are experiencing cyclones every other year, we may not necessarily, be addressing this particular challenge. So we believe in what we call locally led actions. And PACTI is actually a signatory of what we call principles of locally led actions, where we believe in local level programming, where we believe that programs must resonate with the needs, and it must actually be consistent, with the felt needs of the communities at the front line of climate crisis. But maybe just to mention that our role, of course, we are heavy on advocacy. We are heavy in terms of policy influence, to ensure, that we have a proper policy framework, that is going to guarantee, the flow of resources to the communities where it is needed most, and to ensure that actually even the role of the society or in the society have been able to access, justice and an opportunity to be heard. And coming to that, I want to say that taking an example of our preparations for this particular summit, we have a number of events, that are lined up, that are going to ensure, that we're able to, carry out our advocacy work and ensure that representation is taken into account. From tomorrow, we are meeting the Pan-African parliamentarians. And this is a follow-up of a summit that we conducted together with Pan-African Parliament in South Africa in May, which was also attended by President Ruto. And there was a declaration that the Pan-African parliamentarians were able to develop. Now, we'll be discussing that declaration further and checking to see how can it be domesticated in various countries. So if those recommendations are domesticated, then the policymakers will be able to, in their own countries, come up with clearer policy frameworks, that can be able to ensure that we're actually achieving that local led, action on the ground, and ensure that the communities are supported in terms of building their resilience to the impacts of climate change. Friday, again on Saturday, we have what we call Climate Change and Development for Africa Conference, which is a nearly large conference that we normally co-host with the African Union, with the Africa Development Bank, and with the United Nations, Economic Commission for Africa, which also the president is expected to actually, participate in that particular meeting. Now, this is where we look at issues of development and climate change, because you cannot divorce the two. Climate change is no longer an environmental issue. It is an issue that touches on the entire human development, spectrum. And therefore, it's an important conference, which also is a build-up, to the African Climate Summit. And then, of course, we will also be having a big national conference on locally led actions, whereby we'll be looking at a program that has been operational in Kenya, which is financing locally led, actions in Kenya. And this is a project that's been funded by several institutions, including the World Bank. And we want to showcase, some of the successes and basically get to see how can we be able to replicate, those kind of initiatives. We were behind, the conversations around, formulation of that particular program. And that one ensures that we're able to reach the communities on the ground, because the implementation is happening at the county level. And most of the counties have been able to access resources, from that particular fund. Beyond that, the non-state actors will be having a convening, where we'll be developing our own, statement, in terms of what we want to see in the summit. And within the summit, we also have about a number of side events that we're going to conduct. But most important to mention here is that this process, we feel, has not been very much inclusive. And we have had several meetings with the government officials, in charge of this process. We have had several meetings with the African Union itself, and we are saying we are continuing, with the engagement to ensure this inclusivity, to ensure that the indigenous people are on board, to ensure the women are on board, the young people are on board, and we are saying this must not be another elitist, sort of a conference. The other thing that we're also saying is that we cannot organize, this summit, looking at it from, a commercial point of view.
Okay.
It's not a business conference. We cannot trade with people affected by the impacts of climate change.
All right, we will talk about that after this break that we are taking right now, and we will also talk about why you are afraid that the summit may fail to address, the issues that you have raised. We are taking a short break. This conversation will be back shortly. Stay with us.
Ukimwi kwa wengi ni zimwi. Vijana wanaoishi na virusi hivi wanakumbana na mengi.
Imekuwa tu ni matusi. Hata ukipika chakula wengine wana reject, hawataki kula.
Ilikuwa uchungu. I went to an extent yenye nikaandika hard note, nilikuwa naenda kujiua.
Lakini
I have overcome self-stigma. I have overcome the anticipated stigma. I have overcome in external stigma.
Mradi wa Youth Care wa Naya Kenya unawasaidia vijana hawa kujikubali.
Kimenisaidia sana. It has empowered me.
Ungana nami Mutweri Eliud saa 12:30 jioni na saa 3 usiku tarehe 1 Septemba kwa makala ya Ukimwi si Zimwi.
Anamaguna salama bwana nende. Na kamuda ngeregere kamuna tangaze miza mtu kamuna milioma uli.
Kwa leo mpenzi mtazamaji, kipindi hiki kinarushwa moja kwa moja kutoka Kaya Mzimuvya inayopatikana katika eneo la Rabai. Tutakuwa na mambo mengi sana ambayo tutakuwa tunayajadili na kukuburudisha.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to bring up on stage Miss India Kenya Worldwide 2018.
Well then, Mom. As it is, I'm moving to Korea.
Nambi, you only have to stay there as long as you're happy. No one is forcing you.
Ziwa, I think Nambi is lying to me. Well, she hasn't really gone to Korea. She's with Dylan, somewhere near.
Really? What about you? Aren't you already planning to leave him? You seem to prefer Musoke to Joff. The Maso? How could you possibly know about all that? I think that's one of your absolutely diabolical plans. But no matter what you try to do to us, Sahara, I assure you that I will never leave my husband, and he will never ever leave me.
All right, welcome back. The conversation on the climate change action continues. We have Charles Mwangi, who is the head of programs and research, that is for Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, in studio to discuss the preparations of the non-state actors ahead of the African Climate Summit that is taking place next week. Now, Mr. Charles, why are you, the non-state actors, afraid that the summit may fail to address issues in your engagements with the government, that you raise in your engagement with the Government African Union Commission and Claim Africa?
Thank you so much. We are patriotic and we love our continent as non-state actors. And like I did mention, that non-state actors committee encompasses everybody, from across the continent. You can't talk about faith institutions without talking about all African Conference of Churches, for example, who are coordinating the faith cluster within the non-state actors coordination unit. You can't talk about farmers without making reference to East African Farmers Federation and the Raja platform, which brings together all the farmers, within Africa, and several other institutions, that are within that particular non-state actors committee. So it was a carefully constituted, sort of committee, and we hoped that vehicle then would actually be useful to the planners, to the secretariat that is managing this particular process, and we were actually offering ourselves for free, to support in terms of designing that particular conference, because we believe it is our conference. It is supposed to be a conference, for all. But I think there was a challenge in terms of how the secretariat, managed the whole process, because we realized that there wasn't space really for us as non-state actors, even though we had offered ourselves for free to support the process and bringing our experience, to be able to ensure that we have a conference really that resonates, with the needs and the requirements, of our people and what our people would really want to see. Now, we realized that this particular conference was almost taken over, by international, institutions that are not necessarily African institutions. And the fact that people contribute money does not necessarily mean, they really carry, the vision, of our people and the needs of our people, with them, at their heart. And that was one of the challenges that we actually had. So we have had several conversations with the Secretariat that is managing this and with the government. Recently, we had a meeting, with some of top, government officials, checking to see then how can we be able to ensure this inclusivity in that particular process. The other challenge that we realized within the framing of the conversation is that this summit, had been converted into some sort of should I say, a business sort of forum, especially because we gave a lot of prominence to carbon market. And carbon market is really gaining traction, but it is still, a concept that people need to understand, that it does not necessarily translate, into solutions. For Africa, actually we normally call it, for solution, because it is a situation whereby somebody is paying us for us to clean, their mess, so to say. Somebody wants to continue emitting from the north because he can pay you to remove that carbon from the atmosphere, either through tree planting or through engaging in other practices that are going to reduce the emissions or basically remove the greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. But you realize the way this particular trade is actually managed across the world is that about 1 ton of carbon equivalent, which is the unit through which this carbon is actually sold, costs between $5, sometimes $10. But if you look at the investment that goes, in producing that 1 ton of carbon equivalent, it's not commensurate, with the payment, that comes, with the same. And you're saying it cannot be that people are lying to us, that we are making money when we are actually sacrificing a lot, for us to actually engage in that particular carbon trading. You realize that carbon is actually expensive in other countries. You realize when people are trading, in Europe and other countries, it costs as much as $120. But how comes, when it comes now to Africa, that becomes a big problem. And people should stop, telling us about the question of compliance and voluntary market and so on and so forth. The thing is, this is a solution that is not necessarily, viable for our people. And we cannot give prominence to that because we cannot trade with the rights of our people. So we need to see aspect of adaptation, for our people, being given a lot of prominence, so that we can be able to ensure that we have been able to support our communities that are already experiencing the impact. Look at what happened in Northeastern. Look at what happens in places like Marsabit. People lost livestock, almost everything, their livelihoods. Look at Malawi and Mozambique. People losing their livelihoods. The energy systems in Malawi are destroyed every so often, by the hurricanes and so on and so forth. Loss and damage. These are conversations that we thought would actually take prominence, because we have been saying that the climate finance flow in the continent, or basically generally, looking at the entire, infrastructure or for climate finance, it's about 25% that is dedicated to adaptation. 75 goes to mitigation. Yet Africans' needs, for adaptation is actually more than 80, billion. So the convention around doubling adaptation finance would actually gain a lot of prominence. The conversation around, establishing, the framework, for global goal for adaptation would have been given a lot of prominence in this conversation. But now we have converted this into a business sort of conversation. It's so much about trade. And I know the president is, of course, talking about a new, finance architecture globally, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But I think must we connect that, with this conversation around climate change at this particular moment, or are we supposed to look at those critical, elements that we must actually focus on and that are very, very urgent to our people? And I think that is where, or that is the point of departure. But we have been having conversations, like I did mention, and we hope, because we still have some few days, before the conference, that we'll actually be able to see an opportunity where inclusivity is embraced, an opportunity, where we are going to get a product that really can be representative, of the needs of our people in this particular country. Remember, this is not a Kenyan conference. It is a whole African conference. And the product of this conference will be discussed and will be very, very, very key in influencing conversations during UNGA, United National General Assembly, which is happening in the next few weeks. And this document will also be useful to our African group of negotiators in terms of influencing, the outcome again of COP28, which is going to be held in Dubai, later in November and in December, this year. So we're still calling for that inclusivity. At least there has been some conversations. We have made our proposals. We're engaging because we believe in dialogue, because it's our process. And we must actually ensure that it's a process that responds to the needs of all the people.
All right, and in your demands, actually, whatever you're talking about, you've called upon the African leaders, to reject false solutions and narratives, and including the carbon markets, and perhaps the geoengineering, nuclear energy, and principles of shared responsibility. You claim they might be misled, in the issues that I've just listed. How exactly?
Yeah, like I did mention, we must be very careful around how the conversation around climate change is the shape it is taking in the world. And there has been that particular dichotomy whenever we go for COP negotiations, whereby in Africa we are pushing, for our position, and the West will always be against that particular position. We should not actually be the case, because it's clear that the impacts, and science has shown that Africa is actually experiencing the worst impact. In fact, some regions in Africa are already warming beyond the 1.5 that they're talking about. So these impacts are real, and we are saying that it's clear. We normally argue that we are all in the same ship. Africa may be in the lower deck, the others could be the upper deck, but when these ships start sinking like Titanic, we all go down. So therefore, it should not necessarily be an issue of Africa pushing for its own, positions, and that position is not being supported, from the West. Actually, it should be clear knowledge that we need to all work together in terms of ensuring that Africa is actually supported. But we are saying that principle of common but differentiated responsibilities under UNFCCC is a principle that we must really uphold.
Okay.
Those who have emitted more, they bear more responsibility.
All right.
But shared responsibility would mean that, okay, fine, so we have all contributed equally, and therefore we must come to the table and think, together. We must not ignore those historical, issues that we must take into account.
All right.
Carbon markets, like I did mention again, we are not demonizing carbon markets, but we are saying those are not solutions that we want to embrace. And talking about geoengineering, also about sinking carbon through solar radiation, modification, and other geoengineering technologies. That again will not necessarily address our challenges. Let us put the money where it's needed most. Adaptation for Africa. Loss and damage.
All right.
It will be good.
All right. I'm afraid we have to end it at that. We still have many more issues, because the conversation on climate change and climate justice is one that will